Hello, everyone. Welcome to the briefing room today. I'm Terry Moran in for Devin Dwyer.
And I'm Mary Alice Parks. Takes two to sub for Devin.
It does. He's had to have a well-earned day off, and this city is still buzzing from that extraordinary press conference yesterday by White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. Now, the Chief of Staff in the White House, really the most important person in that building who is not called Mr. President. Mick Mulvaney, involved in every decision, helps make sure that what the president wants done gets done. He's at the center of all kinds of things. He came out to announce that next year's G-7 Summit of World Leaders will be held at the Trump Doral. We'll get to that. That's in Florida. But what was extraordinary was when he started taking questions, a few from our own John Carl, who asked him about this swirling controversy around the president's phone call in August with the president of Ukraine. This is the source of the latest impeachment inquiry. I'm sure you know that. Listen to how John Carl gets the answers out of White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney on just what was going down on that call when it came to, was there a quid pro quo? Why was military aid withheld from Ukraine? Listen to John Carl and Mick Mulvaney.
So the demand for an investigation into the Democrats was part of the reason that he ordered to withhold funding to Ukraine.
The look back to what happened in 2016 certainly was part of the thing that he was worried about in corruption with that nation. And that is absolutely appropriate.
But to be clear, what you just described is a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happens as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy. And I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy.
So that question answer hit Washington really like a thunderclap, because that's the Chief of Staff saying, yep, quid pro quo.
Quid pro quo might not be the best use of the... I mean, it's amazing to me to watch the president use that language in terms of the Bidens. He's tried to use that same language to dodge and ditch around. But let's go back to the other phrase. Let's put quid pro quo aside. Get over it.
Yeah.
Get over it is not a legal defense, but it could very well be a savvy political defense. And it could pose a lot of challenges to Democrats, because they're going to have to argue that something that's now in plain sight is still wrong. It's basically the White House saying, if we put it all out there, what could we be hiding?
They're just going to try to brazen their way through what might seem for other administrations and other presidents a real ethical problem, a quid pro quo, the withholding of military aid to the Ukrainians. By the way, 13,000 people have been killed in that war in Ukraine. This is not a game show. It's life and death. And Mick Mulvaney seemed to know that something had gone wrong. So he put out a statement later on in the evening, blaming the media for misinterpreting what he said, he claims. And he added, the only reasons we were holding the money was because of concern about lack of support from other nations and concerns over corruption. That's what he says. Basically, two reasons. The only two reasons, lack of support from European nations and corruption. The problem is that in the press conference, he said several times there were three reasons. And here is how he answered the question of NPR's Aisha Roscoe on that. Listen to how many he says were the reasons for withholding that military aid.
Three factors. Again, I was involved with the process by which the money was held up temporarily. Okay, three issues for that: the corruption in the country, whether or not other countries were participating in the support of the Ukraine, and whether or not they were cooperating in an ongoing investigation with our Department of Justice. That's completely legitimate.
That's kind of digging deeper and deeper.
And very different from that statement they put out later. Something that strikes me, too, about that statement, not only is he trying to say he said something he didn't say, but that idea of rooting out corruption. Because when you look back at the memo about the call, there's not other corruption discussed. Really, the only things the president is asking for the president of Ukraine to look into is a conspiracy theory about whether or not Ukraine was involved in the hacking of DNC servers and the former vice president's family. There's not a larger conversation, at least not in that phone call, about corruption.
Right, and you could have a very large conversation about corruption in Ukraine. However, so how is the president handling this press conference where his #1 top aide, chief of staff, says, yep, there was a quid pro quo, and then kind of backs away from it? Well, here's what the president had to say today.
Mr. President, do you want to clarify what Mick Mulvaney said yesterday?
I think he clarified it.
Translation, I want no part of what my own chief of staff just said.
And his outside legal counsel said the exact same thing.
Right. So the legal team is bailing on Mick Mulvaney. The president wants no part of Mick Mulvaney's bailing on Mick Mulvaney. All this part of this latest impeachment inquiry, deadly serious, actually, for all of the shenanigans in that briefing room. So let's bring in ABC's Kyra Phillips, who's been covering this with us. It has been...
All together.
Yeah, all
okay,
together.
Mick Mulvaney happened at the end of the week. If we just try to back up and go to the beginning of the week, I mean, talk about bombshell after bombshell. It's only been 5 days, and look at everything that we have witnessed. So the depositions, all right, Fiona Hill, that's really what kicked off this entire week.
Now, who's Fiona Hill?
So she was the top Russia advisor that was deposed at the beginning of the week with congressional investigators, those leading this impeachment probe. I took a list, okay, just because it was so complex and there were so many tentacles that came out from Fiona Hill's testimony. So this is where you really saw the Trump barricade start to collapse, right? Because she comes forward, she was the first White House official to cooperate with the impeachment probe. And she talked about being concerned about Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal attorney, being involved in Ukraine and this pressure on Ukraine for political dirt on rivals. Then she actually ties in acting chief of staff Mick Mulvaney. She mentions him in the testimony. So now we're wondering, oh, wait a minute, what's the acting chief of staff? How's he involved here? Because we still haven't heard from him, and if indeed he was involved. Then she goes to National Security Advisor John Bolton, who characterized their efforts in Ukraine as a drug deal. And he says, you need to go to the lawyers. So what does she do? She goes to the lawyers. And then Bolton comes out and describes Giuliani as a hand grenade that's going to blow everybody up. And I just remember everybody asking, wait, what just happened here? Where do we start and where do we end? That's how quickly things started to unravel at the beginning of the week. And that was just one witness.
First day. So she's the witness who really takes you behind the scenes at the White House while this some people are calling it a shadow foreign policy, run through Rudy Giuliani, not a member of the administration, the president's own lawyer and friend, about Ukraine.
And validates the whistleblower's concerns.
And testifies even though there's been so much White House pushback, trying to keep these witnesses from going to the Hill at all.
Right.
And that's what... Okay, let's talk Gordon Sondland then,
yeah,
okay, ambassador to the EU. There was more of Trump's barricade starting to crumble because this is someone who is a very good friend with the president, donated to his campaign $1 million. So I think the White House probably was thinking, this, probably isn't going to be so bad. He comes forward and talks about his concern about Ukraine issues going through the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, and even says, quote, withholding foreign aid in order to pressure a foreign government to take such steps would be wrong. I did not and would not ever participate in such undertakings. In my opinion, security aid to Ukraine was in our vital national interest and should not have been delayed for any reason. So he straight out disagreed with the president and Giuliani getting involved when talking about this quid pro quo.
And clearly would disagree with what Mick Mulvaney just said in the White House, trying to explain that withholding that aid would make some political sense. I mean, we've heard statements like that from every top Republican on Capitol Hill, from Mitch McConnell on down, that have said they thought that aid to Ukraine was essential to basically telling Russia to back off.
And one of the challenges for the White House, for the president, is so many people knew. Right? This was a months-long project that Rudy Giuliani and the president were working on to get some kind of investigation into the Bidens and into this conspiracy theory about the DNC server in Ukraine. And they saw they had leverage with the new president. Could they withhold the military aid to get him to do their bidding? That is the allegation. Lots of people would be involved in that months-long policy process at the White House, at the State Department, in Ukraine, at the Pentagon. All these people will have testimony, pieces to add to the puzzle, and it's going to be hard either to keep them from testifying or to say it's not that, get over it, it's something else entirely innocent.
Well, I'll tell you, diplomats at the State Department are not getting over it. They're pretty upset and feeling that they've been undermined, that their positions have been undermined. Sources telling me they felt they were doing what was right. They were raising concerns about this. They were raising concerns about Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal attorney, interacting and dealing with foreign policy. This is something that they were supposed to be doing, and thought, what's going on here? The president saying that's what he wanted to happen.
I think that's exactly it. What you see again and again is everybody who comes across this Giuliani-led policy knows it's radioactive. And as John Bolton said, he told Fiona Hill, go talk to the White House lawyers, tell them we don't want this, right? People in Ukraine, we don't want we want to handle this country the way every other country is handled. It just seemed wrong, it seems, and that's going to be a problem for the White House as well.
He's not a government employee. He
That's
doesn't have security clearance and is not a part of the administration formally.
Well, and State Department sources also telling me that they don't think Giuliani realizes this, but they believe he was in over his head, that he's been able to work out deals and kind of talk his way out of things. Their feeling is this could possibly lead to some serious allegations, possibly criminal charges.
So where does this go? Right now we are at the point where the Democrats have this kind of bespoke impeachment process. It's different than every other impeachment process that has ever been done. It's not being done with the support of a resolution of the full House, the president, which would offer protections and process rights for the president and the minorities. And the Republicans are complaining about that. It's being done in secret depositions in the House Intelligence Committee. Where does this go from here?
Well, Nancy Pelosi isn't giving a timeline. She's not even saying how long this impeachment inquiry could go on for. And then you'll remember Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell held that press conference and talked to reporters on how this was all going to break down, actually. And he said that under the impeachment rules of the Senate, we would take the matter up. That is, if the vote went to the House at some point and we went to trial in the Senate. But this is what stood out to me. He said senators would then be allowed to speak, which would be good therapy for a number of them. And he sort of added that with a chuckle. And he said, we intend to do our constitutional responsibility. So right now, Pelosi is not giving a timeline. We don't know how long this probe is going to go. We know there's a number of depositions that are going to happen next week. But then, of course, there has to be a vote. If indeed it moves to the Senate and we have a trial, well, and we were talking about this, we had to refresh our impeachment, rules and regulations and how it all goes down. Each senator would have a chance to stand up and do their thing, and therefore, will he be, he could be impeached, of course, but will he be removed from office?
Right.
And half a dozen of those senators are running to replace him.
Right. So it's on the Democratic side. We don't have anybody on the Republican side at this point. Just as a reminder, it takes 67, it takes 2/3 of the senators, of the 100 senators, assuming they're all present, to remove a president from office. And that is a very, very high bar, especially in a Republican-controlled Senate. Bill Clinton, when he was impeached for the Monica Lewinsky affair and lying about it under oath, the Republicans who tried to remove him from office didn't even get 50. I think it was 52 to 48. So Clinton actually still had a majority support in the Senate. With 52 Republicans, could President Trump lose a few Republicans? Could he end up not being removed from office, but having a majority of the Senate saying he should have been?
I think you have to look at the subject matter, too. What we were dealing with President Clinton, this personal issue, versus President Trump. And as we were talking about, that's a national security issue. It's a state issue. So two different
very much so
subject matters here when we're talking about.
And in a re-election year. And we just have no idea how that's going to play. We have a number of Republican senators that are up for re-election, and that changes everything.
It does. It does. Well, all right, Kyra, thanks very much for that impeachment briefing there.
All of the TikTok.
There we go. And then much more to come, believe me. Take copious notes.
Absolutely. As you can see, this week, it really did accelerate, it seems to me. It feels like the evidence hunt, the hunt for evidence, accelerated, thanks in part to the President's own Chief of Staff. So we're going to move on for a minute. We're going to come back to President Trump, but right now let's talk about something very, very serious, and that's what's been happening in Syria. Really in the space of a week as well. The president, after a phone call with Turkish President Erdogan, basically gave the green light, approved the Erdogan plan to invade Syria and displace Kurds in the north towards the Turkish border to 20 miles deep into that country, basically take territory of the country next door to Turkey and drive the people out. That led to this unfolding humanitarian catastrophe and strategic catastrophe. And the upshot of it was the president was essentially abandoning the American allies in that area, the Kurds, 11,000 of whom had fought and died shoulder to shoulder with Americans in putting down the ISIS caliphate in Syria. And that is That's what's been going on there. Now, the president sent Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to Ankara, the capital of Turkey, to talk with the Turkish president. They did reach a ceasefire, 5-day ceasefire. For more on how this is all unfolding, a real crisis in the world and a crisis of credibility for the United States, our James Longman is in the region, and he has this report.
It's a big question. Has this ceasefire held up? Well, the basic answer is that we're just not sure. The Turkish authorities have said that they are honouring the agreement. President Erdogan was saying that today, but the SDF has released a number of statements to journalists saying that the fighting has continued all day. Well, I've got to say that none of the pictures we've seen seem to hold that up to scrutiny, but there are a lot of parts of northern Syria where journalists just can't get to. For the moment, though, I think what we can kind of predict with a certain degree of certainty is that these fighting groups, the Kurds in the north of Syria, are not going to want to vacate that part of the country as per the terms of this deal. That, remember, is what Vice President Pence and Erdogan agreed, that this 5-day period would give these Kurdish groups time to retreat, but their families live in this place. This is a homeland that they are very, very proud to be defending, and I think the likelihood of them moving away from this area is pretty slim. So if the ceasefire isn't holding at the moment, well, it will be there'll be big questions about it in 4 or 5 days' time. What we can say as well is there have been kind of pretty severe humanitarian issues going on in northern Syria. A major water pump in the north has been badly damaged, so tens of thousands of people are potentially without clean drinking water. And I was in a refugee camp here in northern Iraq today, hearing some of the stories of people who have just left. Many more want to come out and are unable to, but those who have left are angry at the United States, pure and simple. They didn't need to be made homeless by this particular conflict, they feel, and they're angry with Donald Trump.
That's James Longman. Thanks, James. On the Syria-Iraq border there, I've been there many times, some of these towns, Kobani and some of the other towns I've been in, and there are going to be 100,000 plus people displaced by this. And for more on the impact of this on the United States and how we are going to be handling this, Connor Finnegan is at the State Department for us. Connor, not everybody, obviously, in the administration is happy about how this is going down.
Yeah, that's right, Terry. A lot of U.S. diplomats and folks at the Pentagon who have worked on this issue for years are deeply disappointed in President Trump's decision here and overall the decision to withdraw from Syria. They understand the sacrifices that U.S. troops have made on the ground, along with American diplomats, and those Kurdish partners, those Syrian Kurdish forces, the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, that fought alongside the U.S. and lost over 11,000 fighters in the fight against ISIS. They're very upset with how this has gone down, but Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, just a moment ago at NATO headquarters in Brussels, was again defending this ceasefire agreement. He told reporters there that while there was some quote-unquote activity today, the violence that James was just alluding to, he said overall this agreement is starting to take hold. And in particular, he pointed to the withdrawal of some of those SDF forces from positions within this safe zone. Now, the one important point here, however, though, is that there is a bit of a disagreement over what exactly this zone constitutes, the parameters of it in general. The Turks have said consistently, including President Erdogan today, that it's a large swath of territory, basically from the Euphrates River in the east to the Iraqi border in the west, and that it extends 20 miles deep into Syrian territory. The U.S., however, has made clear that has not made clear how exactly they interpret it, but Special Envoy for Syria, Jim Jeffrey, said yesterday that only the areas that Turkey already controls are part of this ceasefire. We're still pressing U.S. officials, however, to say specifically how far into Syria they believe this zone extends.
And it's not only people in the diplomatic corps, but people who have served in the armed forces and led the armed forces, who fought shoulder to shoulder with the Kurds who are being displaced. Usually a ceasefire is to ceasefire and keep the situation static. This is basically telling the Kurds to get out of the places that they are right now. And we are hearing from General James Mattis, who was the Secretary of Defense for President Trump and a very decorated Marine in the United States, in the history of the United States. And he has come out, and for the first time, he's taken off after President Trump. President Trump, hearing that Mattis was unhappy with this abandonment of our allies in the field, called him an overrated decorated general. Well, Mattis, at a charity dinner in New York, the Al Smith dinner, fired back. Listen.
I mean, I'm not just an overrated general. I am the greatest, the world's most overrated. Some of you were kind during the reception and asked me, you know, if this bothered me to have been rated this way based on what Donald Trump said. I said, of course not. I'd earned my spurs on the battlefield, Martin, as you pointed out, and Donald Trump earned his spurs in a letter from a doctor.
Donald Trump, of course, excused from military service for bone spurs in his feet. And Mattis is not the only one, not the only military man. The former head of Special Forces, Admiral McRaven, came out with an extraordinary article in the New York Times today in which he said this: as I stood on the parade field at Fort Bragg, one retired four-star general grabbed my arm, shook me, and shouted, "I don't like the Democrats, but Trump is destroying the Republic." That is the kind of reaction that you're getting from this abandonment of the field of America's allies by some of our senior military leaders, former senior military leaders.
But there are a lot of voters and supporters of the president that see this very different politically. They understand that the president said he was bringing American troops home. And whether that's in Syria or in Iraq, that is a line that sells. It sells on the campaign trail. Americans, by and large, are tired of having people in the Middle East, especially people that voted for this president. It was something he ran on.
And it is something, I think, that will remain an issue. I think a lot of people do agree, can't find these endless wars, but how you do it is the question. Now, in the midst of all this, there was, as I mentioned at the beginning, this decision by the White House to hold the next G7 summit of world leaders at the president's own resort, the Trump Doral International, right outside of Miami. This has caused, as you can imagine, a lot of hue and cry. There it is. It's an 800-acre resort. The president himself made a pitch at the last G7 summit. And joining us now is John Hudak from the Brookings Institute. He wrote a book called Presidential Pork. And that is essentially what people are calling this. Should the president be able to award himself a very large government contract for this summit that's coming up?
Absolutely not. We have constitutional protections against the president profiting from foreign countries, and it creates not only basic violations of ethics, but truly rising to the standards of impeachable offenses. And I think beyond all of that, the optics are so terrible for this president, especially this week, but he's, throwing caution to the wind and moving forward anyways.
But this is this is the next step in what's been a pattern, right?
Absolutely. This is a president who cares not about ethics or traditions or democratic norms or the Constitution itself. What he wants is to benefit himself and his family and his children who are employed by the organization that will benefit from the G7, and cares not about what other people do or what other people think that he does. He's just in it for the money.
Now, John, he says, and the White House said, Mick Mulvaney said, the president's not going to profit. Not a dime of profit will go to the president or his family. And he says he's losing money being president of the United States. How do you answer that?
I think that's tough to imagine, that the president is going to charge the Secret Service members who are going to stay there, foreign leaders who are going to stay there, the security details of those foreign leaders, the press, and everyone else at cost. And understanding what at cost means at a luxury resort is kind of hard to understand as well. The president's going to make a lot of money out of this at a resort that last year lost money, or at least its revenue reduced. And so it looks terrible for the president, and I think it probably is as terrible as it looks.
Can you think of any other president who has benefited from the office? We've had rich presidents before, from George Washington, who was very rich.
Sure, we've had rich presidents, and presidents certainly benefit from the office after they leave, through book deals, through speaking engagements, a variety of things. But to have a property, to have a set of properties that you then not only benefit from, right? This isn't like a foreign government spending a couple of nights at the Trump Hotel. This is the president of the United States requiring the 6 other largest economies in the world to pay his organization money. It's appalling to most Americans.
What can be done about it? So let's say there are Americans who do feel that this is beyond the law, beyond what the president should be allowed to do. What's the recourse?
There's a couple of bits of recourse here. The first is to fold in emoluments clause impeachment article.
The Emoluments Clause, that part of the Constitution which says federal officials, government officials can't accept what?
Any foreign payment, any payment from a foreign government or title of nobility, etc. And so
while in office.
While in office, that's right. And so being able to add that as another article of impeachment into the inquiry, that's an option. That said, this is actually going to happen likely after the impeachment process happens. So I think there would be a question as to whether they could sort of pre-impeach him or impeach him in advance for this. But the other recourse is for the Democratic Party to run on this in 2020 in an effort to beat the president.
It's an issue. Do you think it'll strike voters home for voters that the president is? This hotel would not be full in June in Miami, and it's going to be chock full of paying guests.
I think it makes it harder for him to make a political argument against the Bidens. It's harder to argue that another family is trading on their name if the president continues to promote his brand.
Well, and it's more than that, right? If you're an out-of-work auto worker in Ohio and you're saying, how am I going to put food on the table for my family, and then you see the president doing this, it's hard to go to the ballot box and vote for him.
It was a bold move, that's for sure. John, thanks very much. The president really dominating the agenda this week as he does so much. But let's shift gears a little. Let's get out of Washington and the hoo-ha here. This is an interesting story out of the FAA. Officials there are demonstrating an aircraft evacuation. Now, it's pretty crucial. I don't know about you, but when I get on an airplane, I actually do look for the emergency exits. That's one of the things I always do. Maybe I'm just paranoid, but
really,
yeah, I do. Our Stephanie Ramos.
I put in my headphones.
Our Stephanie Ramos is right there, and she's going to take us through what the FAA is showing about aircraft evacuations. You never know.
So this is a mock aircraft to show what it would be like during an emergency. You can see the smoke that's filling up the cabin. These virtual windows are actually monitors showing some type of scenario, and you could hear the crew yelling, evacuate. So this is exactly what the FAA will be testing next month, just how fast passengers can evacuate an aircraft based on the size of the seats and the legroom. So the FAA is set to release those findings summer of 2020. Then it'll be up to a rulemaking committee to decide, to determine whether any changes should be made to the aircraft. So we'll see what happens.
Wow, you really get a sense there of the challenge that would be.
I mean, that was frightening.
That's scary. So the next time you get on the airplane, look for the exits. But here's really one of the great stories of the day and of our time.
Oh, we've been talking about it all day.
Yeah. You intro then.
Oh, it's really exciting to watch the first ever in history that we've been saying herstory today.
Nice.
The first ever all-female spacewalk. There's that NASA footage. 2 female astronauts. Is awesome to watch them breaking that galactic glass ceiling.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember the Apollo program. So I remember, and the notion that you'd see this, 2 women doing the spacewalk, doing the work of astronauts high above the Earth, it would have been revolutionary to the astronauts at that time, and I think to this country at that time. So this is just one of those things that shows how much progress has been made. A lot more to go, but it does make a real difference. And the president,
and hopefully inspires a future generation of female astronauts.
Amen. The president, with his great political instincts, wants to get in on this, and he made a phone call to the astronauts up there. I think we have that. Got it. All right. So they got a call from the president, and what we have to show you is there are new spacesuits, actually. The president trying to boost the manned, now woman-manned space program for the destination Mars, destination Moon, destination TBD. But NASA is now rolling out the newer spacesuits. Take a look at what the next generation of astronauts will be wearing up there.
We're going to Mars, and in order to go to Mars, we have to use the moon as a proving ground. We need to learn how to live and work on the surface of another world for long periods of time, and in order to do that, friends, we need spacesuits. The Artemis generation is now revealing its spacesuits for our generation. Remember remember the Apollo generation. You remember Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. They bunny hopped on the surface of the moon. Well, now we're actually going to be able to walk on the surface of the moon.
The suit itself is very mobile, so I have really good upper torso mobility. I can move my shoulders very easily. I also have really good lower torso mobility, so I can walk, I can lunge, I can squat.
We're about to go through what we call certification testing, make sure that it's going to be working correctly through its actual mission. So excited to get to this milestone and excited about the work that we have coming up.
Remember this, we as the
Those are the new spacesuits. A great story.
Be so cool to go to Mars.
Onward and upward. Mary Alice, thanks for being here. Devin will be back. Thanks for watching The Briefing Room.